As promised, I am doing a follow-up to my previous video. This one here, Canada, Greenland, and beyond, ignoring political theater as U.S. consolidates control over the West. I said that I would do an article about this topic, go into it a little bit more in depth. I have done so. It's for New Eastern Outlook. U.S. consolidates control over proxies amid war on multipolarism. That is what we are watching unfold today, an expanding U.S. war on multipolarism. This has been going on for decades, and it continues taking place even today. No matter what political rhetoric you hear from your politician or political party of choice, that is what is happening. The material reality of what is happening when you cut through the political rhetoric is singular in nature, regardless of who controls the White House and regardless of who controls U.S. Congress, and no matter what American proxies in, say, Europe or Israel or Japan or the Philippines, no matter what they are saying, this is what is going on. So I'm going to read the article. I will give you additional information when and if necessary. I will show you all of the links that I referenced while writing this article, and I am going to begin right now. Behind the political theater that is the US-European split exists an aggressive campaign of US consolidation over its many proxies, including and perhaps especially over Europe itself. Narratives floating through Western media space depict the US as challenging or threatening not only Europe over control of Denmark's Greenland territory, but also Canada in North America. Articles are written telling tales of Europe and Canada seeking leverage against Washington and countermeasures to protect themselves and their interests, up to and including preparations for guerrilla warfare against potentially invading American forces. In reality, nothing of the sort will take place. And this is the point that I've been trying to get across for weeks, if not months, if not for over a year or two. Before President Trump even came into office, I said all of this will continue no matter who wins the election in 2024. This will all continue. And the US is not capable of fighting Russia, China, Iran, and all of these other countries all on its own. It'll depend more and more heavily on its proxies. It'll eat up its proxies long before it allows itself to suffer the costs of its own foreign policy. That is what the US is using Europe to do. That is what it's using all of its proxies to do. Already, opportunities for gaining actual leverage against the United States have been eagerly surrendered to the United States, particularly with the recent decision by the EU for a complete ban on Russian gas imports by 2027. So if you follow Alex and Alexandra of the Duran, they were talking about this in depth when it took place. EU agrees on complete ban of Russian gas imports by 2027. The European Union has taken another step toward ending its energy reliance on Russia by agreeing to stop gas imports from the country, but not all countries voted in favor of the ban. And of course, you're decreasing your reliance on Russia, you are increasing your reliance on the United States, the very country you pose as having this growing split together with, a nation you are accusing of threatening of stripping your territory away from you. Does that make any actual sense? The material reality behind this, does any of that make sense? And the answer is, of course, no. The ban means the EU will completely eliminate any alternative to its growing dependence on US LNG imports, leaving the US with disproportionate leverage over the EU as a whole and its members individually regarding virtually any matter of foreign or even domestic policy. It is inconceivable that the EU's leadership would surrender such leverage to the US amid a supposed and growing split with the US, unless, of course, there was no real split to begin with. You would not surrender this type of leverage to the US unless you are working in favor of US interests at the expense of your own region's interests. And people have a hard time understanding why the EU would be doing this. It's very simple. The US, over many decades, has infiltrated Europe's political system as a whole, individually in different nations, just like it does all around the globe. It has politically captured the continent, and it controls the political system. It controls the special interests driving Europe politically and economically. And so, just like it does with Ukraine is a very transparent example of all of this. the government in Kiev is not working in favor of Ukraine's best interests. It's working in favor of US interests. It is fighting a US proxy war against Russia, not only at the expense of Ukraine's interests, but at the expense of Ukraine's existence. And Europe is just a larger version of this unfolding. Let's talk about how this US-European split is just a matter of perception management. Instead, what is unfolding is perception management meant to shape both the American and wider Western public ahead of implementing the publicly declared division of labor and burden sharing network announced by the Trump administration and already taking shape during the previous Biden administration. This is continuity of agenda. This was taking shape under the Biden administration, and the Trump administration took what the Biden administration was already doing and is now building rapidly on top of it. And this perception management works so well, not just in the United States and not just across all of Europe, but around the entire world, because again, the US controls global information space. There are very few exceptions. Otherwise, the US almost with no contest, with no exceptions, almost controls all global information space. And so whatever they say, people will be inclined to believe it because they are bombarded by this. The algorithms favor these messages and buries the actual objective truth. It was under the Biden administration that the first National Defense Industrial Strategy was published, admitting to the US's failure to match Russian, let alone Chinese military industrial production, and the necessity of the United States to consolidate control over its vast network of allies and partners. That's exactly what it said in the paper, allies and partners, combining their collective resources, industrial capacity, and military power to confront Russia and China's growing power across all relevant domains. And I have some quotes from this paper. You can download it here. You have to get an archived version of it. It's very hard to find the original PDF. Of course, I saved a version of it when it first came out. But this was 2022 National Defense Strategy, and I did an article about this and at least one or two in-depth videos on this. So under a section in this paper titled Engage Allies and Partners to Expand Global Defense Production and Increase Supply Chain Resilience, the Biden-era paper noted, and this is a direct quote from the paper, the global activity of pacing threats increasingly requires a global approach to defense industrial relationship concerns and competition. International allies and partners, each with their own robust defense industries, will continue to be a cornerstone of the Department of Defense's concept of integrated deterrence. In other words, integrating all of the industrial output of all of America's proxies, integrate it all so that it serves US interests in a more concerted and efficient manner. Instead of having it going in all different directions, serving the interests of all of these different countries, because they are US proxies, they should all be consolidated and serve American interests. This was already going on under the Biden administration. Indeed, the global system of alliances and partnerships is central to the NDS, the National Defense Industrial Strategy, NDIS. It's calling it the NDS in the paper itself, which calls to incorporate allies and partners at every stage of defense planning. Such linkages and relationships will continue to be a cornerstone of integrated deterrence and resisting and, if necessary, defeating known and emerging threats. And of course, they mean nations like Russia and China and anyone else who insists on investing in a multipolar world rather than accepting being subordinated under US primacy. The paper also noted, again, this is another direct quote, the United States has a complex web of friend-shoring suitable alliances. Friend-shoring. Okay, instead of offshoring, friend-shoring. It's the exact same thing. So friend-shoring suitable alliances and partnerships around the world. A partial list includes Australia, Canada, the European Union, India, Israel, Japan, Mexico, South Korea, Taiwan, and the United Kingdom. So the United States sees all of these nations as simply an extension of its own political, military, and industrial power. The paper defines friendshoring as, again, another direct quote from the paper, a process that engages allies and partners in production and processing of critical and strategic materials and supplies. And what they mean is production and processing of critical and strategic materials and supplies to serve U.S. interests, not to serve their interests, to serve U.S. interests. The concept of the U.S. exploiting its web of friendshoring partners to compensate for the U.S.'s own limits regarding military-industrial production, and I talked in depth about what these limits were related to. The U.S. is driven by corporate financier interests that prioritize profit over all other purposes, even the actual purpose of winning all of the wars they need to fight to establish global primacy. They will still put profit over that purpose, which means they will never achieve the level of production they need to achieve these geopolitical objectives. This is why they want to exploit their partners and allies, their proxies. So again, the concept of the U.S. exploiting its web of friendshoring partners to compensate for the U.S.'s own limits regarding military-industrial production and to serve as an extension of America's own military power has been continued, even accelerated, during the subsequent Trump administration. In a February 2025 directive, I've gone over this many, many times. This is essential reading. The link will be in the video description below. This was U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth back in February 12th, 2025, so a year ago. He delivered this directive to Europe in Brussels. He made it clear that Europe in particular would have to increase defense spending from 2% of each member nation's GDP to 5%, which all European nations have now subsequently agreed to do. So there's this big US-European split, right? But when US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth told them to go from 2% to 5%, they all agreed to do it without hesitation, eagerly. And they even reported back to the United States and said, yes, sir, we did it. You said 2% to 5%, and now we're doing it. Secretary Hegseth also demanded Europe prepare troops for deployment to Ukraine to ensure any freeze in the fighting would be made permanent, and noted that Europe must donate more ammunition and equipment and expand its defense industrial base. Again, all steps Europe has since taken despite claims of a growing US-European split. So they're posing as if there's some sort of split, but they're doing literally everything the US demanded Europe do. So it does not add up. Even at face value, it doesn't add up. Finally, Secretary Hegseth made clear that the US was not abandoning Europe amid its own proxy war on Russia. You have to remember, this war on Russia through Ukraine is a US proxy war with Russia. It is not a European war. Europe has nothing to gain from this. It is actually losing tremendously because of it. So for Europe to continue this proxy war without the US or with a reduced US involvement is simply Europe picking up for the US on America's behalf. It has nothing to do with serving Europe's own interests. So finally, Secretary Hegseth made clear that the US was not abandoning Europe amid its own proxy war on Russia, but rather establishing a division of labor that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and Pacific respectively, as a direct quote from his directive from February last year, admitting that the US must prioritize China and the Indo-Pacific, recognizing the reality of scarcity in terms of the US confronting both Russia and China at the same time. The US realizes it cannot do this all on its own directly. It needs to use its proxies to achieve this. Toward the end of the same year, the Trump administration published its national security strategy. It's right here. The link will be in the video description below. I've done an in-depth video. I've done at least 2 videos on this as well. This was published last year, which included an entire section titled Burden Sharing and Burden Shifting, highlighting the necessity of the US using US allies and partners, proxies, to add to America's own limited power. This is what the document stated. This is a direct quote from the Trump administration national security strategy published late last year. The United States will organize a burden sharing network with our government as convener and supporter. This approach ensures that burdens are shared and that all such efforts benefit from broader legitimacy. In other words, the US is going to consume more and more of its proxies' own resources, population, industrial capacity for its own foreign policy objectives. It'll also force all of these nations to legitimize whatever it is the US is trying to achieve worldwide. The model will be targeted partnerships that use economic tools to align incentives, share burdens with like-minded allies, and insist on reforms that anchor long-term stability. They're openly saying we will use carrot and stick to force these countries to do what we want them to do, and they will carry out reforms that we tell them to carry out to make them more capable of serving our interests, even if it comes at their interests. And that's where the 2% to 5% spending on defense, that is exactly an example of what they're talking about. This strategic clarity will allow the United States to counter hostile and subversive influences, anyone opposed to American hegemony, efficiently while avoiding the overextension and diffuse focus that undermined past efforts. In other words, the US cannot do this all on its own. It needs to consume its proxies to achieve this. That is what they are openly saying in this paper if you read it carefully and objectively. What this burden-sharing network represents is the US's use of subordinated nations and regions as an extension of its own military, economic, and industrial power, pursuing foreign policy objectives at the cost of these nations and regions. And again, the US war on Russia through Ukraine, Europe's involvement has come entirely at Europe's expense. To the benefit of America, absolutely at Europe's expense. They're being deindustrialized. This whole energy crisis that they faced is because they are obediently subordinating themselves to the US, participating in a proxy war against Russia that is not their own war against Russia, and it is destroying Europe. And this is what the US plans to do with every single one of its proxies, current proxies and future proxies that it plans to politically capture and coerce. This has already manifested itself as joint arms production or expanding joint arms production schemes where nations like Germany and Japan have been or will begin mass producing US-designed weapons like the Patriot missile air defense system and munitions for US-made multiple launch rocket systems to compensate for the US's own inability to sufficiently expand military industrial production at home. Again, I've gone into depth on why the US cannot expand production at home sufficiently. It's profit over purpose. They are just completely incapable of doing it. Japan, which has manufactured Patriot missiles on a relatively small scale since 2008, more recently doubled production and has even begun exporting these missiles back to the United States starting in 2024 in direct response to limits in US military-industrial production exposed in the ongoing proxy war in Ukraine. If you don't believe me, here's the BBC article in 2023 reporting on this. And this, again, was all taking shape under the Biden administration long before the Trump administration announced its burden-sharing network. Japan to send Patriot missiles to US, which may aid Ukraine. Why is Japan making Patriot missiles and then sending them back to the US? What sense does that make? Are they actually making money doing that? Probably not. Not much. Not making it worth their own trouble and time. Since the Trump administration took office, attempts to rapidly accelerate this process of consolidation has included proposals to radically rewrite both US laws and those of its allies, proxies, as well as openly expressing a desire to outright seize territory, Greenland and Venezuela. They've already announced that they politically captured Venezuela. It certainly seems like they have. And they continue moving towards seizing Greenland as well as facilities, ports near the Panama Canal. Do you remember that? They're in the process of attempting to do that, deemed necessary for the explicit purpose of confronting both China and Russia. So people were pointing out how in this national security strategy, the US never announced that China and Russia were extreme threats that the US must prioritize. Yet if you actually read it carefully, they don't mention Russia and China by name, but they continuously refer to some unnamed threat. They obviously mean Russia and China. And since then, in other documents, they have openly mentioned Russia and China. In April 2025, CNN article, this one, US and South Korean warship maker signed deal that could help narrow naval race with China. So the US is incapable of making anywhere close to even half the number of ships China is churning out every single year. So the US is thinking about changing its own laws, forcing other nations to change their laws and their priorities to help expand shipbuilding outside of the US, because it is physically impossible to expand it sufficiently inside the US. So the CNN article noted US interest in using South Korean shipyards to build and repair US warships, because US shipbuilding and repair capacity has drastically decreased over decades and is incapable of closing the gap on its own with China, as pointed out in the Biden-era National Defense Industrial Strategy paper. Again, I've covered that in depth. The CNN article pointed out that South Korean shipyards were already repairing US warships in theater, meaning in Asia Pacific, where the US seeks to encircle and contain China. So they need to repair them near China, because this is where they plan on using these ships to encircle and contain China. The same article mentioned the necessity of changing current US laws prohibiting foreign nations like South Korea from building US warships. The US itself is not and will not be capable of building itself. Nations like Japan and the Philippines are circumventing their own laws to allow both a wider US military presence within their territory, as well as for their own military forces to play a more integrated and active role in advancing US foreign policy in terms of confronting and containing China in the region. We have examples of this. This was from last year, late last year. Pacifist Japan moving from exclusive self-defense to military buildup. For what reason? They're going to confront China, one of their largest, most important trading partners. What do they benefit by doing this, except being dragged into another self-destructive war, which they are still reeling from the last time this happened, which was World War II, which is why they had a pacifist defense policy in the first place. And then here, CNN, this was 2023. This was under the Biden administration. US secures deal on Philippines base to complete arc around China. They're just openly admitting what this is for. This is all about encircling China. This does not benefit Japan or the Philippines. It destabilizes the whole region. Both of these nations depend on for their own economic well-being. So why are they doing this? Because they've been politically captured by the US. Both countries are literally militarily occupied by the US, and they are doing this to serve US interests at the expense of their own interests, possibly even their own existence, just like Ukraine, just like the rest of Europe. And just to illustrate this, this is Japan. This is what they export out to. US is their first largest export market. China is number 2. And actually, if you count Hong Kong, China actually is Japan's largest trade partner, and you should count Hong Kong because it is literally part of China. And then in terms of imports, China by a long shot. And if you look at exports and imports, Asia in general is Japan's most important region. So if they destabilize this by allowing themselves to be pushed into a proxy war with China, they're going to destabilize the entire region and destroy their own economy. What about the Philippines? China is their largest export market and by far their largest import market. And again, Asia, all of this green, import and export, is their most important region of the world in terms of trade and economics. And they're endangering all of this to play this Asia-Pacific version of Ukraine, because the US has politically captured them and they're incapable of throwing off US coercion, and they are being pushed into a proxy war just like Ukraine was. Of course, by doing so, both nations are undermining regional stability required for their own peace and prosperity. I just showed you where they do most of their trade, as well as their own respective relationship with China itself, both nations counting China among their largest, most important trading partners. And now Europe is preparing to surrender itself into similar receivership to be used to advance US foreign policy objectives at Europe's expense, and to a much greater degree than it already has between 2014 and today regarding the ongoing US proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. They have already suffered significantly playing a role in this US proxy war on Russia and Ukraine, and now they're going to be fed themselves into this proxy war. That is what Secretary Hegseth was laying out back in February, and that is what Europe has been preparing to do to themselves ever since that directive was delivered. Europe's participation in these US policies has left the region itself in terminal decline, with its collective industry collapsing because of rising energy costs, collapsing social programs as greater sums of public funding are diverted to underwriting Washington's proxy war with Russia and Ukraine, and the possible collapse of Europe itself as the prospect of a direct confrontation between Europe and Russia is increasingly presented to the European public as both a necessity and an inevitability. Right here, articles like this. Europe is preparing for possible war with Russia without the US, just as US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth told them to last year. He literally said, you are going to go do this without us. And now they are preparing to do this without the US. And they understand that they will be fighting a very dangerous war without direct US participation. But of course, they are fighting it on behalf of the US. Ukraine itself is a microcosm of this wider burden-sharing network in which US proxies are compelled to abandon their own objective best interests in favor of serving US interests at their own expense. Ukraine's political system was violently overthrown by the US in 2014 and replaced by a US client regime for the sole purpose of transforming Ukraine into a battering ram to be used against neighboring Russia. Regarding wider Europe, over the decades following World War II, the US has politically captured the continent, replacing national centers of political and economic power with the regional bureaucracy of the European Union, overriding the best interests of the European people regionally and collectively in service of advancing US special interests. This includes everything from waging wars of aggression alongside the US within Europe, Serbia, and now Ukraine, and far beyond it, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, to subordinating and even sacrificing its economic wealth to isolate and cripple the economies of targeted nations ranging from Iraq and Iran, and more recently, Russia and China. Every time the US tells Europe to put sanctions on all of these countries that Europe itself is doing business with, it costs Europe to do this. They are cutting off economic prosperity that they had up until then been enjoying, and very much so in the case of Russia and China. Again, among their largest, most important trading partners, especially regarding things like energy and finished goods. While explanations for the EU's leadership's behavior have dwelled on ideological or political obsession, or a recent divide between a conservative US administration and a liberal EU political order, the answer is far simpler. Just as in the case for Ukraine specifically, where a US-installed client regime was placed into power solely to serve US interests at whatever the cost to Ukraine, Europe in general has been consolidated under the EU for the very same purpose. EU leadership has been placed into power, shaped and directed by the same US-based special interests that likewise drive American foreign and domestic policy, regardless of the cost to the average American citizen. The EU has been captured long ago, and it serves as an extension of US foreign policy. And that's it. That's the explanation. There is no split. There's no ideological obsession inside the EU regarding Russia, because they had been doing business with Russia up until 2014. The people that have been put into place that seem ideologically blinkered and bent on war with Russia, they were put there by the US specifically to serve US interests at the total cost of Europe. It's so simple. Even as EU leadership sells a narrative of a widening US-European split to justify the transfer of greater percentages of public funding for what is entirely Washington's proxy war on Russia, it continues to consolidate power over its individual member states for the sole purpose of transferring this power to and in service of US interests. The ban on Russian gas imports only one of many recent examples. So they're pretending that there's this US-European split. Again, if you go back and you read this, Secretary Hegseth told Europe, you need to lie to your people. You have to tell them Russia is an existential threat and Europe needs to spend more on defense. But all of this is solely in service of America's proxy war on Russia has nothing to do with serving European interests. There is no actual threat from Russia to Europe. It is a lie. Secretary Hegseth is telling them to tell this lie to their people. The US-European split is to make this all more convincing, to make it look like the US abandoned Europe. Europe faces this big threat from Russia, and they need to face it alone, and they need to make huge sacrifices. For the European people, they need to make huge sacrifices to go off and fight Russia, when in reality, they're simply fighting Russia on America's behalf. It really is that simple. Until a greater percentage of journalists, analysts, and the general public can strip away this political theater used to perpetuate this continuity of agenda and reduce analysis to its material realities, what is actually happening in reality, the way the world actually works versus the way politicians claim it works, revealing the simple structure of what is modern American empire at work, this destructive process will continue to erode and destroy both members of the multipolar world and the West itself. The West itself is being destroyed in the process as well. Ordinary Westerners are not benefiting from this in any shape, form, or way. They are victims of this whole process, just like the multipolar world the US is waging war against. Only time will tell whether or not the multipolar world can expose this process for what it is and propose a more compelling vision of a collective future for the world, and in the meantime, defend itself and its aspiring members from the global war Wall Street and Washington is waging and now expanding against the multipolar world. So I hope that lays to rest this whole so-called US-European split. I hope that makes it abundantly clear. I hope it is abundantly clear that the US is not retreating to the Western Hemisphere. It is not seeking coexistence with Russia or China, especially China. It has no intention of coexisting with China. Everything it's doing is to wage war against the multipolar world, to strip it away, isolate China, and crush China ultimately. That is what it has been doing for decades. That is what it continues doing aggressively, openly. That's what it's doing. And only delusion and deceit could possibly blind the public to any sort of other alternative theory of what is happening. The US is openly preparing for war with Iran. So all of these people that said, don't worry about the US invading Venezuela, overthrowing the government. It's retreating to the Western Hemisphere. It's gonna have its sphere of influence. We'll let Russia and China have their sphere of influence, and it's retreating to the West. So don't worry, everything's gonna get better. They're getting ready for another round of war with Iran, halfway around the world. So no, they didn't retreat to the West. They're waging war on the multipolar world, the whole world, east, west, north, south, everything on planet Earth. That is what is happening. That is what will continue to happen. I will continue keeping an eye on it. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check out the video description below. If you go to my YouTube channel and you look at the video description here and you click more, you will see all of the links that I referenced in the video. You will find other places where my work is published. I have a blog, landdestroyer.blogspot.com. I'm on Telegram, X, and on Rumble. There are also ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no resources to spare at all, and all you can do is like, share, leave a positive comment, send a news tip, all of this greatly helps. This is what makes my work possible. I appreciate it sincerely, and as always, thank you for watching.